different. And I thought, what am I doing? And not in a panicked kind of way, but more in a sobering way, because here I was at 50 years old being a total beginner again. Hi, I'm Meredith Christo, and I'm glad you're here. In 2024, George and I started looking for space to put our personal training studio. And as I sat down to read over the commercial lease before handing it over to our attorney, I remember thinking, I've spent 25 years negotiating corporate contracts. I've done this before. I've read the fine print. I've pushed back on terms. I knew exactly what questions to ask. But something about this felt completely foreign. The language was different, the stakes were definitely different, and I thought, what am I doing? And not in a panicked kind of way, but more in a sobering way, because here I was at 50 years old being a total beginner again. And I want to talk about that feeling today because I think a lot of us are living inside it and assuming that it means that something is wrong. In the first episode of this podcast, I talked about the space between who I had been as a corporate leader and who I was becoming after I resigned. And I mentioned that, walking out the door that day was the easy part, but that space in between, that space between who I was and who I was becoming has been really hard. And this is a big part of it. I knew that I was making the right decision. I wasn't looking back. I wasn't wishing that I'd stayed. But there was a feeling underneath all of it, this feeling of starting over and not feeling established. And I purposefully used the word established. I didn't use successful. I didn't mean accomplished. I mean that feeling you get when you've been doing something long enough that you know exactly what you're doing. You know where you belong. You know what's expected of you. You know how you contribute. And honestly, it's how you see yourself. And there's something incredibly grounding about that. And, when you lose that, even if it's by choice, even if it's for the right reasons, it can really kind of knock you sideways. And here's what I find so interesting is, we celebrate children for learning. We admire college graduates for, taking a risk. We tell them, take a risk. You're young. We expect young professionals to ask questions. But, somewhere along the way around midlife, we start believing that we should already know everything. We should already know how to do this. We should already have everything figured out. We should know what's next. And it's not like anybody actually says that to us, but we start saying it to ourselves. And I don't think we realize how much that one belief is really shaping our decisions. So when I left corporate and started building this next chapter, I knew how to lead people. I had built teams. I'd been solving complex problems for years. And that 25 years of experience doesn't just disappear because you change directions. But I never built a business with a physical location. I had never worked with a bank to get a business funding. I never had managed a P&L where every single number was mine to lose sleep over. And I was surprised and embarrassed by how embarrassed I felt every time I didn't know something. And yes, I was embarrassed that I was embarrassed, if that is even, a thing. And it's not that, nobody made me feel that way. No one was expecting me to know everything. I expected me to know everything. And there was a voice in my head that kept saying, you're 50 years old. Why don't you already know this? And then one day, just kind of out of nowhere, I thought, why would I know this? Like, I've never done this before. Of course I don't know. And it really made it all okay. And it sounds almost ridiculous saying it out loud now, but when you're living inside that feeling, it doesn't feel simple at all because it was never really about what I knew. It was about what not knowing seemed to say about me. And those are two very different things. So I think this is where a lot of people stop themselves, not because they aren't capable and not because they don't want something more, but because that moment they stop feeling established, they assume they're on the wrong path. And that's when it feels good and it's easy, and we normally turn around and we go back to what is comfortable. But what if that feeling isn't evidence that you've made a mistake? What if it's evidence that you've stepped into a place you've never been before? Which can be exciting. It's kind of like when you take a trip somewhere you've never been and you get to explore and you get to learn and you get to go different paths that you didn't mean to go down. And the reality is that every single expert we've ever admired has been a beginner many times over. And the only difference between them and everyone else is that they didn't stop when they no longer felt established. They stayed long enough to build that new foundation so they could continue to grow. And that's what I've been learning in real time. Like, the goal was never to protect the identity I'd already built. The goal is to trust myself enough to evolve from that one. And that doesn't mean forgetting everything that I've learned along the way. It means, carrying all of that wisdom into a place where I'm still willing to learn. So here's the invitation for all of us. Not to have it all figured out, but to stop expecting ourselves to have it all figured out. Because the next chapter of your life doesn't require you to know everything. It simply requires you to stay long enough to learn, to build the foundation so you can feel established again. So if this episode names something you've been feeling, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And tell me what chapter is making you a beginner again. Or if you know someone who needs to hear this, send this episode on and share it with them. I'll see you in the next episode.